Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalamu ala Sayyidina wa Maulana Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa azwajihi wa ashabihi wa warasatihi wa awanihi wa ansarihi ila yawmiddin wa lanatullahi ala adaihi ila yawmiddin. We are inshallah going to read this, at least the introduction of Wael Hallaq's The Impossible State. With the intention of learning from it and about it, inshallah, from an Islamic perspective. Okay. I'll start with at least reading an introduction, and then we'll see whether it is worth it to read some other selections or read the entire book. So, but at this point I'm non-committal. What I'm committing to is to do a slow reading of the introduction and see what's all about. So, the impossible state. So, Islam, politics and modernities, moral predicament. So, let's look around the book first. Wael Hallaq, as I said in my introductory video, is a Palestinian Christian. And the book's title, The Impossible State, so what is state is already there, so state itself can't be impossible. In fact, modernity is based on the existence of this state at this different level. Without the existence of this state, modernity cannot sustain itself. But somehow Islam shouldn't touch or come close to this state. Not this state, but having a state which can, compete with or protect Islam against this rival state, which is a monster in a sense. So it's about a state, about possible state, but so there's a state which is possible because it exists actually, and there's the proof of its possibility at all level, in one form or another. So that state can't be impossible, but the state which people are struggling for, which they call Islamic State, that seems to be impossible. And that's the thing about revolutions and counter-revolutions. So one thing we should understand about revolutions, for example. Firstly, we've lived in the age of revolutions. In the 19th century and 20th century, you had Glorious Revolution. Before that, you had Industrial Revolution. That's in Britain. Then you had French Revolution, American Revolution, late 18th century. Then you had uprisings in 1848, very revolutionary situation. The whole 19th century was a century where the existing system feared revolution, and the revolution was a possibility. And then 20th century you have Russian revolutions, 2 Russian revolutions. Then you have, Iranian revolution. You have revolution in Afghanistan, and there were other revolutions in other parts of the world. So we live in the age of revolutions, or we have lived in the age of revolution. But the system, even if the system, say, the system which exists today, came into existence through a series of revolutions. But the system, once it is in place, one of the duties of the system is to make it possible that there's no revolution against it. So once the revolution is successful, it tries to make it impossible that there's any other revolution, or there is any further revolution, or there is a revolution against its existence. So a system which comes into existence through revolution, once it is in power, makes it possible that there's no further revolution, or at least there is no revolution against the system. So obviously it does all sorts of things, but it also creates a discourse about the impossibility, irrationality, immorality, and of any further revolution, or revolution as such. So this discourse, and the multiplication of this discourse and recreation of this discourse is part of the sustenance of and the continuity of the existing or the hegemonic system. Okay. That's why there's no contradiction that, for example, one of the most important political philosophers of modernity or liberalism is John Locke. John Locke is the philosopher of revolution, liberal revolution. But Locke is also, once this liberal revolution is successful, is also in his discourse you can also find an argument for anti-revolution. So there's no contradiction there, because the revolution he is talking about is different from the impossibility of revolution he also talks about. So the revolution which is possible is the revolution which he supports, and revolution which is impossible is the revolution against this. And by impossibility we can mean many things. At the level of discourse, you can say it is immorality or irrationality or imprudence and all that. But it's also impossible in the sense that we must make it impossible that any revolution is successful against this system. Okay, so we should situate the talk of impossibility of a state in this context, at least partially. And if we look at from the angle of a state, there are states, very powerful states. The most powerful state in the history of humanity which exists today, American state, British state, French state, German state, Chinese state. Nothing like this has existed in human history. And these states has belonged to a system, a global system, which is hegemonic, which relies on institutions which are state-like institutions, which are, even though we don't have a global state as such, there are states within these states which play the role of global state as well, to sustain that system and to resist any resistance against that system. So it is in the interest of these states that any anti-states, any states against these states are considered impossible, even theoretically, let alone practically. Because you can't counter the hegemony of these states without creating states within these states which can, at least, there is a possibility one day overwhelm these existing states and create a new hegemonic system which is different from the current system. So it is in the interest of state to sustain this sort of discourse about the impossibility of any alternative version to existing states. And the argument for the impossibility, we will look at the Weil-Hallach's argument in detail, but the arguments for the impossibility of revolution and the argument for the impossibility of any alternative states are many. But for example, one of them is the argument put forth by Habermas, for example, with a great pro-American, militantly pro-American defender of modernity, and vehemently anti-revolutionary. And his arguments against, even though he's supposed to be partially, at least, coming from Marxist background, because after the Soviet Union, all Marxists, he was never, he was always, his Marxism was Western Marxism anyway. I don't think he ever had revolutionary pretensions. But his argument against revolution and its impossibility is basically moral. And the argument is that today the state is so complex that it cannot be overcome. So any struggle to overcome this state and build a new state, overthrow this state and build a new state, is immoral, because that will actually lead to disintegration of life, disintegration of societies, which will result in immeasurable misery So his argument, partially argument against revolution, is based on the fact that the modern state is very complex, so complex that it can't be actually overthrown. So revolution has become impossible because modern state is just too powerful, too complex, the concentration of power is so huge that it is impossible. So revolutions were possible in 19th century but it's because the states were still consolidating themselves. So now once these states have consolidated themselves, I mean, you can have a revolution against weak states like Iran or in Afghanistan where there's a vacuum, but in the developed world at least, or the part of the world where the states are strong, revolution is not just impossible but immoral, because we are sure that it will result in misery for people without any positive outcome. So while Halak's argument or whatever he is going to do should be contextualized in this broad background in a sense. And part of title is The Impossible State, Islam, Politics and Modernities, Moral. So I don't know whether this moral predicament belongs to moral predicament of Islam and politics as well, or is just the moral predicament of modernity. But while Halak is in a sense a postmodernist, and his argument should be understood in the context of the debate between modernity versus postmodernity. So at least partially postmodernist movements emerge out of the collapse of communism and the collapse of the revolutionary movements within the Western world. So the struggle against modernity no longer was possible in the form of a revolutionary struggle. So modernity can't be overthrown in toto. So resistance against modernity became a single issue movement. And that's what postmodernism is about. So postmodernism is basically you concede that it is impossible to overcome modernity, even though modernity is at least partially morally objectionable. So but since it is impossible to overthrow the modernity, so what remains is to develop partial critiques of modernity, moral critique of modernity, which will practically speaking either would lead to passivity, or if it does lead to activism, that activism would be in the form of single issue movements. So there's no systematic threat to modernity. So postmodernity is basically exhaustion of the revolutionary struggle against modernity, and it is also partially exhaustion of modernity itself. So those who think that these postmodern movements are some sort of revolutionary ideals, so there's a lot of moralization, a lot of moralization, or a lot of I mean, its results are like can be contradictory. It can lead to moralization, it can lead to passivity, it can lead to hardcore realism as well. uh, which is one strand in the single issue movements. So you either have a gay movement or environmentalism, etc. But there's no thought of us posing a systematic threat to modernity, even if from a left modernist perspective, as it was with Marxists and communists, because communist struggle against modernity was never a total civilization struggle, because they shared um, common roots in Enlightenment philosophies with rightist or with the Western modernity. So anyway, and obviously we can quiz the impossible state. And by the way, impossible state would be a sweet song in the ears of Arab and Muslim secular dictators and semi-dictators and fascists and all those in the Muslim world, since the state, any alternative state against the state is impossible, morally as well as practically, I guess. We'll see. And impossibility itself can be questioned in various ways. So impossible state, logically impossible. So we would have to physically impossible, situationally impossible, morally impossible. What is the impossibility? And obviously we would need to define state, etc. What is the state? So a state is being proclaimed certain state is being proclaimed impossible, probably meaning undesirable as well, in an era where state is the hallmark of civilization and the very foundation of civilization and a system. Okay, let's go back and probably we'll stop here. And these are just a few pointers. That's how we should start reading a book, really. We should. And next time we'll start from here, inshallah.